So what Iran's trying to do right now is that they think that they're going to have a much easier president to deal with a President Joe Biden. So what they're doing is a couple of things. They're increasing their nuclear stockpile. They've begun enriching uranium again. They've said, well, we may negotiate a new deal, but whatever happens, our missiles are not to be renegotiated. And they also are anticipating that when the Biden administration comes in, it will give them a lot of financial aid and economic assistance, in addition to allowing them to sell their oil on the open market by dropping the sanctions. So I think Iran is they're not looking for a war, Joe, but what they are looking to do is to position themselves in a place where they think the Biden administration is going to come in and really give them everything they want and restore Iran to its greatness. And frankly, from our perspective, that would be to restore Iran to the position of enabling terrorism throughout the region.
Now, you have the report in the Washington Times, which says that in a cabinet meeting there's a report in the Washington Times basically talking about the fact that you had Iran Rouhani issuing death threats a few days ago, basically the life of will come to an end. How do we get here to a point where we even have the potential for a Biden administration wanting to do business with an entity, a nation, a foreign actor that clearly means us to do harm?
Not only mean talking about assassinating President Trump, which I don't think they have a snowball's chance in hell of doing, but it also they're constantly chanting "Death to America," that we're the greatest evil in the world, followed shortly thereafter by Israel. Look, Iran is looking at the world and saying, okay, if we'd had to put up with another Trump term, we would have been in big trouble. We would have had to negotiate peace agreements with everybody. But now we think somebody's just thrown us a life preserver. And so we're hoping with a Biden administration, they're going to go back and do it. The Biden, same people who negotiated the Iran nuclear deal are coming back into a Biden administration. So they think that it's going to be deja vu all over again for Iran. Now, how did we get to this point? Well, I think we had a flawed nuclear deal with Iran in the first place, and the Biden administration, Joe, the Obama administration sold that deal as, oh, we're stopping nuclear arms in the Middle East. That deal did nothing of the sort. It just put Iran's nuclear weapons program on pause for a few years, and now they're off pause. And so I think it was a flawed deal in the first place. President Trump got us in the right place in the Middle East, particularly with regard to the peace agreement between Israel and the Arab nations. And if the Biden administration is smart, they will take that and they will run with it. And they'll say, okay, part of the Middle East is at peace. We want to have a tough new deal with Iran, and we want to have the entire region choose peace and prosperity over continuous warfare.
Right, and to that point, I want to pivot a little bit to Georgia because the election is so critical down there, and yet at the same time, buried in all of that infighting for the Republicans and buried within the mudslinging down in Georgia are very serious implications from a foreign policy standpoint. What are the things that you see as kind of the linchpin here? What are the dangers of putting somebody like Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock in the Senate and giving Democrats the power to craft a new type of foreign policy that does not put America first?
Joe, I'm really glad you asked that question because people aren't focused on that, and they should be. If the Biden administration, they control the White House, if Democrats control the House of Representatives, if Democrats control the United States Senate, which is what this Georgia election is all about, then the Biden administration is in a position to do several things. They'll have a new Iran nuclear deal, which will, in fact, probably hustle in a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Number two, they'll concede everything to China. And China has looked at the landscape. They've looked at the Biden administration appointments, and they've decided they're making their move now. They plan to emerge from not only the pandemic, but the Biden term as the dominant power in the world. So they're making their move. They have a new economic agreement, trade agreement with the Pacific powers. They just a couple of days ago signed a new economic agreement with the European nations. And they're moving out in the world to say, look, the pandemic, that wasn't us. That was America that did it. So you're going to see a Biden administration soft on China, in part because the Biden family has financial relationships with China. You're also going to see a Biden administration that's going to cut back on defense programming, and a Biden administration that's not going to invest in the technologies of the future, the kind of technologies which really will determine the next generation. So I look all around and I say, one major sort of theme that all these things have in common, the Biden administration will be weak. They'll be pushed over. They've already been pushed over a few times by the Russians and the Chinese, and I think it's going to happen again. It's going to be even more sort of weak than the Obama administration was against America's adversaries.
Right now, you talk about, let's talk about actually the region right now. You have the Abraham Accords, which I think in many ways, most people agree will outlive not only President Trump, but come to define what success looks like in the Middle East, that type of ways where you can isolate individuals that don't come to the table by fostering new types of agreements. We saw that with the UAE, and yet at the same time, how do we juxtapose that with now Jonathan Pollard spent 30 years in a U.S. prison for spying, receiving a hero's welcome from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Obviously, again, we have no greater friend than our friend in Israel, but at some point, we also have to hold our friends accountable.
Well, we absolutely have to hold our friends accountable. I mean, not only Israel, but all over the world. We do have allies. We do have countries with which we have trade agreements and, more importantly, security agreements. But that doesn't mean that we give up our sovereignty any more than any other country would give up its sovereignty. I mean, look what just happened in Europe. Nobody was really paying attention because it happened on Christmas Eve. But the British pulled out of the European Union. Why? Because they wanted British sovereignty. They wanted British laws to apply to the British people. And in the same regard in the Middle East, we have been sucked in to all of the fighting in the Middle East for decades. And part of that fighting was Israel. Part of that fighting was the Arabs. Part of that fighting was the Iranians. And so I think that when you just mentioned a second ago, the Abraham Accords, I do think that these will outlive President Trump. And I think that they'll even outlive the Biden administration. As much as they might try to screw that one up, I think that has now going to take on a life of its own. And it's going to